You've heard this one before. If you're so passionate about decolonizing, why are you speaking in English? Arey didi, Hindi mein bolo. Why not your mother tongue? Or stop being a hypocrite. Now, all of this sounds really clever. It is meant to. And if it were true, it would mean something devastating. It would mean that almost every successful indigenous land claim, every language revival grant, every court case, petition, archive recovery, cultural protection battle fought in the last 50, 100 years was invalid because most of them, if not all, were argued in English. So if that question is right, then the empire did not just steal land, it stole the right to be heard. Sit with that. I'll come back to it. But first, I need to show you what was broken. You see, there's a kind of history that refuses to die. You can ban the languages, you can burn the libraries, you can rename the streets, but the story still throbs in the songs, in the chants of the mantras, and in the way we still pause to thank the very ground we walk on. Good day, namaste. You're listening to the Mitra Desai Show. I'm your friend and host, Mitra. And on this show, we follow the traces of civilizations that have survived erasure and kept remaking themselves, from Bharat to Australia and beyond. Today, the question that we're asking is, why are we speaking about colonization in English, the very language of the colonizers? Well, let's start right here in Australia. Before the British arrived in 1788, this continent pulsed with over 250 distinct Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. Now, these were not just ways of speaking. They were law, they were navigation systems, they were climate sciences encoded in the songlines. They carried survival knowledge across tens of thousands of years. The country was mapped through language with a precision no colonial map could ever achieve. Now cut to today. According to ATSIS, only around a dozen Aboriginal languages are still being learned by children as a first language. More than 100 others survive in endangered or revival states. What does that mean? It means they're spoken by only a handful of elders, they're stored in recordings, or are being painstakingly rebuilt through community programs. But this did not happen naturally. You see, children were taken from their families. It's called a stolen generation. They were forced into missions and institutions where speaking their language was punished. It was punished with beatings, with isolation, and with shame. English-only schooling did not just discourage language, it shattered the transmission itself. Languages that had survived ice ages were reduced to whispers in ceremonies or the last breath of dying elders. And this wasn't informal cruelty, this was law. Queensland's 1897 Aboriginals' Protection and Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. It created reserves. On these properties, the movement of the Aboriginal and the indigenous peoples was controlled. Their families were broken up, and it also prevented gathering from where their very language lived. So this was not decline, this was demolition. English took over the public sphere. And today, if you want to revive any of the languages, you have to write the grant application in English. You have to argue your case in English. You justify survival in the language that tried to end it. Hold that thought. Because this was not just an Australian exception, it was a template. Across the British Empire, the same sequence repeated, but it was adapted to local conditions. But the logic was the same. First, break the transmission. Consider Aotearoa or New Zealand. The Native Schools Act of 1867 mandated English-only education. Now, Maori children were punished for speaking in Te Roa Maori, just like the Aboriginal children in Australian missions were. Then, destroy prestige. So, for example, in Ireland, penal laws from the late 17th century made English the language of the court, the education, and employment. So you see, Irish was not formally banned, it was just treated as backwards. Can you see the pattern there? It was just something that you had to outgrow if you wanted to survive. Now, in Scotland, in 1616, Privy Council blamed the Gaelic language for barbarity and imposed English schooling in the Highlands. The suppression intensified after the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion. Languages survived, but only as a sign of poverty, not power. And then came the most refined stage, because by the time the British reached India, they had learned something. You don't really have to ban a language to kill it. You just have to make it useless. Now, India was not a settler colony that could be emptied by force like Australia was. India was already a civilizational web. You had pathshalas teaching mathematics through poetry. You had libraries preserving millennia of philosophy, science, law, medicine. You had a mixture of Sanskrit, Persian, and several other vernacular languages. So the empire used policy. We already know that on 2nd of February 1835, Thomas Babington Macaulay wrote his infamous Minute on the Indian education. His goal was explicit: to create, in his words, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. He dismissed Sanskrit and Persian as inferior to one shelf of a good European library and argued that all state funding should be redirected to English education. That same year, the Governor General issued the English Education Resolution of 1835, effectively implementing Macaulay's recommendations. Funding for traditional institutions collapsed. English colleges expanded across the presidencies. Then, in 1854, Wood's dispatch formalized English as the language of higher education and administration. Universities in Calcutta, Madras, Mumbai became English medium gateways to degrees, jobs, and power. By the late 19th century, the overwhelming majority of India's administrative and professional elites were English educated. Sanskrit, Persian, or any regional literature, they were not banned. They were just sidelined. Knowledge systems that had sustained civilizations were reframed as relics. So English decided who could succeed. Let's pause and go back to the opening question here. So if you really care about decolonization, why are you speaking in English? Because after all of this, after the transmission was broken, the prestige was destroyed, and institutions dismantled, English became the only language allowed to carry power. So the real question is, if English was the only language permitted in courts, in governments, in archives, in funding systems, what language should we now use to dismantle that system? That's the part that the gotcha question misses. English wasn't just the language of the empire. It was engineered to be a bottleneck. The courts, still operating under the British frameworks, still English. The government forms, submissions, petitions, international advocacy, English. In India, Macaulay is quoted from his original English text to expose the system he designed. Across the world, whether it is the Maori petitions or the Yolnu submissions or post-colonial movements, they all have to speak to each other in English. So if English becomes the lock, we make it the key. This is not hypocrisy, that's strategy. In his 1986 book, Decolonizing the Mind, rejected English entirely, and he chose to write in Gikuyu to rebuild the cultural sovereignty from the ground up. On the other hand, Chinua Achebe chose another path. He seized English and bent it, turning the colonizer's language into a carrier of the African thought. Today, we walk both paths. We rebuild our languages slowly, deliberately, fiercely, and we use English where it gives us leverage. in courts, in policy, in public opinion. From Bharat to Australia, we name erasure using the empire's own tongue. Because decolonizing the mind doesn't mean pretending English never happened. It means understanding why it happened and deciding what we make of it next. So, if this conversation shifted how you think about languages and power, do leave me a comment below. Share your thoughts. Tell me what question you want for us to take apart next. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.